The world ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. It started with reports of a strange virus, one that seemed to reanimate the dead and turn them into mindless, flesh-eating monsters. At first, people laughed it off as a hoax, a story too ridiculous to be true. But then, the videos started surfacing online. Grainy, shaky footage of people being attacked by their own loved ones, their bodies torn apart by ravenous teeth and clawing hands. The laughter turned to screams, and the world descended into chaos. Governments fell, cities burned, and the dead rose from their graves to feast on the living. It was a nightmare made real. A horror story come to life. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my apartment, my eyes glued to the news reports and social media feeds. I watched as the infection spread like wildfire, consuming entire countries in a matter of days. I watched as the military tried and failed to contain the outbreak, their bullets and bombs doing little to stop the relentless advance of the undead. And then, when the power went out and the screens went dark, I watched as the world I knew crumbled away, leaving only a hellish landscape of blood and death in its wake. I barricaded myself inside my apartment, listening to the screams and gunshots echoing through the streets outside. I rationed my food and water, praying that the nightmare would end and that I would wake up to find it all a bad dream. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and still the nightmare persisted. The city I had once called home was now a desolate wasteland, its streets choked with the bodies of the dead and the debris of a civilization in ruins. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. But I also knew that venturing out into the city meant risking everything. The zombies were relentless, their hunger never satisfied. They would chase me down, tear me apart, and add me to their ranks without a second thought. And yet, what choice did I have? To stay meant certain death, a slow and agonizing end as my body wasted away from hunger and thirst. To go meant facing the horrors of the outside world, but at least it offered a chance, however slim, of survival. In the end, it was an easy decision. I gathered what few supplies I had left, taking only what I could carry on my back. I armed myself with whatever weapons I could find. A kitchen knife, a baseball bat, a rusty pistol with a handful of bullets, and then, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, I stepped out into the ruins of the city, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. I didn't know what the future held, or if there even was a future anymore. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving, because in this new world, the only thing that mattered was staying alive. And I would do whatever it took to make sure that I did. The undead were closing in, their ravenous groans echoing through the deserted streets. I ducked behind an overturned car, my heart pounding in my chest as I checked my ammo. 3 bullets left. Shit. I had been out scavenging for supplies, scouring the abandoned supermarket for anything that might keep me alive another day. But I had gotten careless, stayed out too long, and now I was paying the price. The zombies had come out of nowhere, a dozen of them at least, their rotten faces twisted with hunger as they spotted me. I had managed to take down a few with my trusty pistol, but there were too many. And now, with only 3 rounds left, I knew I was royally screwed. I peered over the car's hood, watching as the hordes stumbled closer, their bloody hands outstretched, eager to tear into my flesh. I couldn't help but think back to the days before the outbreak, when life was normal, when I didn't have to fight for survival every waking moment. But those days were long gone, and I had to focus on the present if I wanted to live. I checked my backpack, desperately hoping I had missed a stray bullet or two, but no such luck. I had used up most of my ammo during a run-in with a pack of zombies a few days earlier, and I hadn't had a chance to restock. Stupid mistake. The groans were getting louder now, the stench of decay filling my nostrils as the undead closed in. I knew I had to make a run for it, but the odds weren't in my favor. The nearest safe house was at least a mile away, and the streets were crawling with zombies. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had been in tough spots before, had faced down death more times than I could count, but this time felt different. This time, I wasn't sure if I would make it out alive. I checked my watch. 4:47 p.m. The sun would be setting soon, and the zombies would only become more active in the darkness. It was now or never. I gripped my pistol tightly, my finger hovering over the trigger. 3 bullets. 3 chances to clear a path. I would have to make every shot count. I braced myself against the car, my muscles tensed, ready to spring into action. The zombies were almost upon me now, their rotten fingers clawing at the air, desperate to sink into my flesh. I closed my eyes for a split second, sending a silent prayer to whoever might be listening. Then, with a roar of determination, I vaulted over the car and charged forward, firing off my remaining rounds as I ran. The bullets found their marks, dropping 3 zombies in quick succession. But there were still too many, their grasping hands reaching for me as I dodged and weaved through the horde. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm and jerked away, narrowly avoiding the snapping jaws of a particularly fast zombie. I lashed out with my empty gun, smashing it against the creature's skull with a sickening crunch. But the blow cost me precious seconds, and the other zombies were closing in fast. I could feel their putrid breath on the back of my neck as I ran, my lungs burning with the effort. I rounded a corner, desperately searching for a way out, but found only more zombies blocking my path. I was trapped, surrounded on all sides by the undead. As the horde descended upon me, I knew that this might be the end. But I was determined to go down fighting, to take as many of these bastards with me as I could. I reached for my knife, the blade glinting in the fading sunlight. If I was going to die, I would die on my own terms. And so, with a final battle cry, I charged forward into the sea of grasping hands and snapping teeth, ready to meet my fate head-on. I stumbled through the door of my safe house, slamming it shut behind me with a frantic kick. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. I had barely made it out of the horde alive, fighting my way through the sea of zombies with nothing but my knife and sheer determination. My clothes were torn and bloodied, my skin covered in scratches and bruises, but I was alive. For now. I took a moment to catch my breath, my eyes scanning the small room that had been my sanctuary for the past few weeks. It wasn't much, just a tiny apartment on the top floor of an abandoned building, but it was safe, or at least it had been. But as I looked around, my heart sank. The room was in shambles, the furniture overturned and the windows smashed. And there, in the corner, was the unmistakable sight of blood, dark and glistening in the dim light. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for my knife. I wasn't alone. I crept forward, my senses on high alert as I scanned the room for any sign of movement. And then I heard it. A low, guttural moan coming from the bedroom. I gripped my knife tighter, my heart pounding as I inched towards the door. I could hear the zombie shuffling around inside, its movements slow and clumsy. I knew I had to take it out, but I hesitated. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from the fight with the horde. And if there was one zombie in the apartment, there might be more. But I didn't have a choice. This was my only safe haven, the only place I had left. I couldn't let the zombies take it from me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the fight to come. Then, with a roar, I kicked open the bedroom door and charged inside. The zombie was waiting for me, its rotten face twisted into a snarl as it lunged forward. I dodged to the side, my knife flashing out in a quick strike that severed the creature's spinal cord. But even as the zombie fell, I heard more moans coming from outside the apartment. The noise of the fight had attracted them, and they were closing in fast. I ran to the window, my heart sinking as I saw the horde gathering on the street below. There were dozens of them, their eyes glinting with hunger as they stared up at my building. I knew I couldn't stay here. The zombies would find a way in, and I was in no shape to fight them off. I had to run, to find a new place to hide. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with whatever supplies I could find. A few cans of food, a bottle of water, a handful of bandages. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I could hear the zombies pounding on the apartment door now, their fists drumming against the wood like a macabre symphony. I knew I only had seconds before they broke through. I ran to the window, my heart pounding as I looked down at the drop below. It was a long way down, but it was my only chance. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. Then, with a final prayer to whatever gods might be listening, I jumped. The fall seemed to last forever, the wind rushing past my face as I plummeted towards the ground. I hit the pavement hard, my ankle twisting beneath me with a sickening crack. I screamed in pain, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. The zombies were already streaming out of the building, their eyes locked on me like heat-seeking missiles. I forced myself to my feet, gritting my teeth against the agony in my ankle. I had to keep moving, had to find somewhere safe to hole up and tend to my wounds. I limped down the street, my eyes scanning the buildings for any sign of shelter. And there, just ahead, I saw it. An old, abandoned apartment complex. Its windows boarded up and its doors barricaded. It wasn't much, but it was my only hope. With a final burst of energy, I hobbled towards the building, praying that I would make it inside before the zombies caught up to me. But even as I reached the door, I could hear them behind me, their groans getting louder with every passing second. I was out of time, out of options. And so, with a desperate cry, I threw myself against the barricade, hoping against hope that it would hold against the undead tide. I collapsed against the door, my heart pounding as I listened to the zombies pounding against the barricade outside. The wood creaked and groaned under the assault, but it held, at least for now. I slid down to the floor, my injured ankle throbbing with every movement. I knew I couldn't stay here long. The zombies would find a way in eventually, and I was in no shape to fight them off. I forced myself to my feet, gritting my teeth against the pain as I limped deeper into the building. The hallways were dark and narrow, the air thick with the stench of decay. I could hear the zombies moaning outside, their cries echoing through the empty halls like a twisted chorus. It was a sound that had haunted my dreams for months, a reminder of the hell that the world had become. I stumbled into an abandoned apartment, my eyes scanning the room for anything that might be useful. The place had been ransacked long ago, the furniture overturned and the cupboards emptied. But as I searched, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I spun around, my knife at the ready. There was nothing there, just the empty apartment and the echoes of the damned outside. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I limped into the bathroom, hoping to find some bandages or painkillers to dull the agony in my ankle. But as I rummaged through the medicine cabinet, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty bathroom and my own haggard reflection staring back at me. But then I saw it again, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, my knife raised, and found myself face to face with a message scrawled on the wall in dried blood. "They're coming," it read, the letters jagged and uneven. "They're coming for us all." I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the message. Who had written it? I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I didn't have time to dwell on cryptic messages or phantom watchers. I had to focus on survival, on finding a way out of this nightmare. I searched the rest of the apartment but found nothing of use, just more evidence of the building's former occupants and their grim fates. Bloodstains on the walls, shattered family photos, a child's teddy bear lying abandoned on the floor. I felt a pang of grief as I looked at the bear, thinking of all the lives that had been lost, all the families that had been torn apart by the apocalypse. But I couldn't afford to dwell on the past. The present was all that mattered now. I limped back into the hallway, my ankles screaming with every step. I could still hear the zombies outside, their cries growing louder and more insistent with every passing minute. I knew I had to find a way out of the building, had to find somewhere safer to hole up. But as I turned the corner, I found myself face to face with a sight that made my blood run cold. There, At the end of the hallway was a group of zombies, their faces twisted into snarls of hunger as they spotted me. And behind them, written on the wall in the same jagged letters as before, was another message. "They're here," it read, the words dripping with malice. "And they're hungry." I felt a scream building in my throat as the zombies charged towards me, their rotten hands outstretched and their jaws snapping with hunger. I turned to run, but my ankle gave out beneath me, sending me crashing to the ground. As the zombies closed in, I closed my eyes, waiting for the end to come. But even as their hands reached for me, I heard a voice whispering in my ear, a voice that was all too familiar. "Welcome to hell," it said, the words dripping with venom. "We've been waiting for you." I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around the empty apartment. It took me a moment to realize that it had all been a dream. The zombies, the cryptic messages, the whispering voices. But the terror was still real, still lingering in the back of my mind like a half-remembered nightmare. I sat up slowly, my injured ankle throbbing with pain. I had managed to wrap it with some torn sheets I had found in one of the apartments, but it was still swollen and tender to the touch. I limped over to the window, peering out through the cracks in the boards. The street outside was empty, the only sound the distant groans of the zombies that lurked in the shadows. I felt a pang of hunger in my stomach, a reminder that I hadn't eaten in days. My supplies were running low, and I knew I would have to venture out soon to search for food. But the thought of leaving the relative safety of the apartment building filled me with dread. I had barely survived my last encounter with the zombies, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to face them again. I spent the next few hours searching the building for anything that might be useful. A weapon, some bandages, a can of food that might have been overlooked in the initial looting. But I came up empty-handed, my desperation growing with every passing minute. As the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to take a chance, had to risk the dangers of the outside world if I wanted to survive. I gathered what little supplies I had left, a few scraps of food, a bottle of water, my trusty knife, and limped towards the door. I could hear the zombies shuffling around outside, their moans growing louder as the darkness deepened. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Then, with a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the night. The street was dark and deserted, the only light coming from the flickering glow of a few scattered street lamps. I could hear the zombies in the distance, their cries echoing through the empty city like a twisted lullaby. I crept forward, my heart pounding with every step. I knew I had to be quiet, had to avoid drawing attention to myself if I wanted to make it back alive. But as I rounded the corner, I heard the familiar groan of a zombie, close and getting closer. They were on me in an instant, their hands grasping at my clothes and their teeth snapping at my flesh. I lashed out with my knife, my blade sinking into rotten flesh and shattered bone. But there were too many of them, and I could feel myself being dragged down, my strength fading with every passing second. Just as I thought all hope was lost, I spotted a narrow alleyway to my right, a possible escape route that the zombies had overlooked. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, I wrenched myself free from the grasping hands and stumbled towards the alley, my ankles screaming with every step. I could hear them behind me, their cries of rage and hunger echoing off the narrow walls. But I didn't look back, didn't dare to slow down for even a second. I spotted a small air duct set into the wall, just big enough for me to squeeze into. I didn't hesitate, throwing myself forward and wriggling into the cramped space just as they rounded the corner. I held my breath, my heart pounding as I listened to the zombies shuffling around outside. I could hear them sniffing the air, their rotten noses seeking out the scent of living flesh. But they didn't find me. And after what felt like an eternity, I heard them shuffling away, their groans fading into the distance. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I was alive, but for how much longer? I was injured, starving, and alone in a city full of the undead. As I lay there in the cramped air duct, listening to their distant moans, I couldn't help but wonder if I had finally reached the end of my rope. If this was the day that the apocalypse would finally claim me as one of its own. I don't know how long I stayed in that air duct, drifting in and out of consciousness as the pain in my ankle throbbed and my stomach growled with hunger. It could have been hours, or even days. In the endless darkness of the city, time seemed to lose all meaning. I was weak, dehydrated, and in desperate need of medical attention. If I didn't find help soon, I would surely succumb to my injuries and become just another corpse in the streets. I crawled out of the air duct, my muscles screaming in protest as I forced myself to my feet. The alleyway was quiet, the only sound, the distant groans of the zombies that lurked in the shadows. I limped out into the street, my eyes scanning the storefronts for anything that might offer salvation. And there, just a few blocks away, I saw it. A pharmacy. Its windows still intact and its shelves lined with precious medical supplies. I felt a flicker of hope in my chest as I stumbled towards the building, my ankle throbbing with every step. If I could just make it inside, I might be able to find the antibiotics and painkillers I needed to survive. But as I drew closer, I heard that familiar groan coming from inside the pharmacy. I hesitated, my hand reaching for my knife. I was in no shape to fight, but I couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. Those medical supplies could be the difference between life and death. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Then, with a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The pharmacy was dark and musty, the air thick with the stench of decay. I could hear the zombies shuffling around in the shadows, their moans echoing off the shelves like a twisted chorus. I crept forward, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. I could just make out the outline of the prescription counter, its shelves still stocked with precious medications. But as I reached for a bottle of antibiotics, I heard a growl behind me. I spun around, my knife raised, and found myself face to face with a zombie, its rotten face twisted into a snarl of hunger. I lashed out with my blade, my aim wild and desperate. The knife sank into its eye socket, sending a spray of black blood across the floor. I grabbed as many bottles of medication as I could carry, stuffing them into my backpack with shaking hands. I could hear the zombies getting closer, their shuffling steps and hungry moans growing louder with every passing second. That's when I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat. The roar of an engine, coming from outside the pharmacy. My backpack was ripped out of my grip by a zombie. I didn't stop, desperate to reach the survivors outside. I burst out onto the street, my eyes wide with desperate hope. But there was no one there. Just an empty street and the distant groans of the undead. The engine noise had been just another cruel trick of my mind, a hallucination born of desperation and fear. I felt my knees buckle beneath me as I sank to the ground, my body shaking with sobs of despair. I had risked everything for those medical supplies, and now they were gone, scattered across the floor of the pharmacy like so much worthless junk. As I sat there in the middle of the street, my ankle throbbing and my mind reeling with hopelessness, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the end. If I had finally reached the point where even my own mind had turned against me, taunting me with false hopes and dreams of rescue. But even as the darkness closed in around me, I knew I couldn't give up. I had to keep fighting, had to keep clinging to whatever shreds of hope and humanity I had left. Because in a world gone mad, hope was the only thing that could keep me alive. I don't remember how I made it back to the apartment building. My memories of that night are a blur of pain and fear, a fevered haze of stumbling steps and desperate prayers. But somehow, I managed to drag myself back to the relative safety of my makeshift shelter, collapsing onto the hard floor as soon as I was inside. I could feel the fever taking hold of me, my body shaking with chills even as my skin burned with heat. I knew I was in bad shape. The wound on my ankle had become infected, and without proper medical treatment, I was at risk of losing the limb altogether. I tried to focus on my surroundings, to ground myself in the present moment. But as the fever grew worse, I could feel my grip on reality starting to slip. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like malevolent entities. I could hear whispers in the darkness, voices that sounded strangely familiar and yet utterly alien at the same time. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the hallucinations. But behind my eyelids, the visions only grew more vivid. I saw myself as a child, playing in the backyard of my family home. The sun was shining and the grass was a vivid green, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace and happiness that I hadn't known in years. But then the sky darkened, and I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The familiar groan of a zombie coming from inside the house. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch in horror as the door burst open and a horde of the undead poured out, their rotten faces contorted with hunger. I screamed as they descended upon me, their teeth tearing into my flesh and their hands ripping at my clothes. I could feel the life draining out of me, my blood pooling on the grass like a macabre painting. And then, just as I thought all hope was lost, I heard a voice calling out to me. It was a woman's voice, soft and gentle, and yet filled with a strength that I had never known before. "Wake up," she said, her words cutting through the fog of my fever dreams like a beacon in the darkness. "You have to wake up." I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I was back in the apartment building, my body drenched in sweat and my injured ankle throbbing with pain. But even as I struggled to sit up, I could still hear the woman's voice echoing in my mind. "You're not alone," she said, her words filled with a quiet certainty. "There are others out there, other survivors like you. You just have to find them." I shook my head, trying to clear the cobwebs from my mind. I had been alone for so long, fighting to survive in a world gone mad. The idea of other survivors, of someone else out there who understood what I was going through, seemed like an impossible dream. But as I sat there in the darkness, my body racked with fever and my mind reeling with visions of the undead, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's words held a kernel of truth. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Maybe there was still hope, even in this bleak and unforgiving world. I forced myself to my feet, gritting my teeth against the pain in my ankle. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment building forever. Sooner or later, the zombies would find me, and I would be trapped like a rat in a maze. I had to keep moving, had to find some way to survive. And if there were other survivors out there, then maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to build a new life from the ashes of the old. I gathered my meager supplies, wincing as I put weight on my injured leg. It was going to be a long and painful journey, but I knew I had no choice. As I stepped out into the empty streets once more, the woman's voice echoed in my mind, a whisper of hope in a world gone mad. "Find them," she said, her words a promise and a prayer all at once. "Find them, and together you can build a new world from the ruins of the old." Days turned into weeks as I fought to survive in the ruined city. My fever dreams haunting my every waking moment. The infection in my ankle had spread, and I knew that without proper medical treatment, I was living on borrowed time. But even as my body grew weaker, my mind remained fixated on the woman's words from my fever dreams. "Find them," she had said, and I clung to that hope like a drowning man to a life raft. I spent my days scavenging for supplies, picking through the rubble of abandoned buildings and raiding the few remaining stores that hadn't been completely looted. At night, I barricaded myself in whatever safe haven I could find, listening to the groans of the undead outside and praying for a miracle. And then, one day, I found it. I was picking through the ruins of an old electronics store, looking for batteries or anything else that might be useful, when I saw it. A small, battery-powered radio. Its antenna bent but still intact. I felt a surge of excitement as I picked it up, my hands shaking as I fiddled with the dials. I had been alone for so long, cut off from the rest of the world, that the idea of hearing another human voice seemed like an impossible dream. But as I turned the dial, my heart racing with anticipation, I heard only static. I cursed under my breath, my hopes dashed once again. And then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. A faint, crackling voice, barely audible over the static. Survivors. Safe haven. Coordinates. I felt my heart skip a beat as I strained to hear more, my hands gripping the radio so tightly that my knuckles turned white. But the voice faded away, swallowed up by the static once more. I fiddled with the dials, desperate to hear more, but it was no use. I sat back, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just heard. There were other survivors out there somewhere, and they had found a safe haven, a place where the undead couldn't reach them. I knew I had to find them, had to make contact somehow. But how? The radio was old and battered, and I had no idea how to boost its signal or extend its range. For days, I tinkered with the radio, trying everything I could think of to make contact. I climbed to the top of the tallest buildings I could find, hoping to catch a glimpse of the safe haven or pick up a stronger signal. But there was nothing. Only the endless groans of the undead and the static crackling of the radio. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. If the voice on the radio had been just another fever dream conjured up by my desperate, lonely mind. But even as my hopes began to fade, I clung to the memory of that voice, to the promise of a world beyond the ruins of the city. I knew I had to keep searching, had to keep fighting. Because if there was even the slightest chance that I could find the other survivors, that I could escape this nightmare and start a new life, then I had to take it. And so I pressed on, my body weak and my mind weary, but my spirit unbroken. I would find them, I told myself, no matter how long it took or how many zombies I had to fight through. Because in a world gone mad, hope was the only thing that could keep me alive, and I would cling to that hope with every last ounce of strength I had left. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next as I fought to survive in the ruined city. The radio had given me a glimmer of hope, but as the days turned into weeks with no further contact, that hope began to fade. My supplies were running low, and I knew I would have to venture out soon to scavenge for more. But my injured ankle had never fully healed, and the thought of facing the zombies again made my stomach churn with fear. But I had no choice. Without water, I would die. And the only source I knew of was a water tower on the roof of a nearby building. I waited until dawn, when the zombies were at their least active, before setting out. I moved slowly and carefully, my eyes scanning the streets for any sign of movement. But as I approached the building, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The familiar groan of a zombie coming from just around the corner. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't fight, not with my injured ankle. My only chance was to run. I took a deep breath and then sprinted for the building, ignoring the pain that shot through my leg with every step. I could hear the zombie behind me, its shuffling steps growing closer with every passing second. I reached the door and yanked it open, ducking inside just as the zombie's grasping hands closed on empty air. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, my chest heaving with exertion. But I couldn't rest for long. I knew there would be more zombies coming, drawn by the noise. I had to keep moving. I limped up the stairs, my ankle screaming with every step. I could hear the zombies behind me, their groans echoing in the stairwell. I reached the roof and staggered to the edge, my eyes scanning the surrounding buildings for any sign of a way out. But there was nothing, only a sea of ruined buildings and shambling zombies. And then I saw it, a narrow beam stretching from the roof of the building to the roof of the one next door. It was a perilous path, but it was my only chance. I took a deep breath and stepped out onto the beam, my arms outstretched for balance. I could feel the wind whipping at my hair and the hot sun beating down on my skin. I inched forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the zombies behind me, their groans growing louder as they stumbled onto the roof. I was halfway across the beam when I heard a crack. I looked down and saw the wood splintering beneath my feet. I knew I had only seconds before it gave way entirely. I lunged forward, my fingers scrabbling for purchase on the opposite ledge. And then the beam gave way, and I was falling. I screamed as I plummeted towards the ground, my arms windmilling desperately. But somehow, miraculously, I landed on a ledge just a few feet below. I lay there for a moment, my heart racing and my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the zombies above me, their groans fading as they lost interest and wandered away. I had made it, but just barely. I crawled to the edge of the ledge and looked down at the water tower below. It was so close, and yet so far away. I knew I would have to make my way down the side of the building, clinging to whatever handholds I could find. It would be a perilous journey, but I had no choice. I took a deep breath and began to climb, my fingers aching and my muscles trembling with fatigue. But I kept going, driven by the knowledge that without water, I would surely die. It took me hours to reach the ground, my body drenched in sweat and my mind reeling with exhaustion. But as I staggered to the water tower and filled my bottles with the precious liquid, I felt a sense of triumph washing over me. I had survived, against all odds. And as I made my way back to my makeshift shelter, my body aching and my mind weary, I knew that I would keep surviving, no matter what the world threw at me. As I sat in my makeshift shelter that night, sipping on the precious water I had risked my life to obtain, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn my life had taken. Just a few short months ago, I had been a normal person with a normal life. I had a job, friends, family, all the things that I had once taken for granted. But then the world had ended, and everything had changed. The dead had risen, and the living had been forced to fight for survival in a world gone mad. I had lost everything, my home, my loved ones, even my sense of who I was. The person I had been before the outbreak seemed like a distant memory, a half-forgotten dream. Now, I was a survivor, a scavenger, a fighter, a lone wolf in a world of the undead. I had learned to live on the edge, to take risks and make sacrifices just to stay alive. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the distant groans of the zombies outside, I couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. What was the point of surviving if there was no one left to live for? What was the point of fighting if there was no hope of a better future? I thought back to the radio transmission I had heard, the promise of other survivors out there somewhere. It had given me a glimmer of hope, a reason to keep going. But as the days had turned into weeks with no further contact, that hope had begun to fade. I was starting to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, if the voice on the radio had been just another trick of my lonely, desperate mind. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the wall, feeling the weight of my exhaustion and despair pressing down on me like a physical force. I had been alone for so long, cut off from any sense of human connection or companionship. The isolation was starting to take its toll, wearing away at my sanity like water on a stone. I knew I couldn't go on like this forever. Sooner or later, something would have to give. Either the zombies would get me, or the loneliness would drive me mad. But what other choice did I have? The world had ended, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. All I could do was keep moving forward, keep fighting for survival in a world that had no place for the living. And yet, even as I felt the darkness closing in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still some small spark of hope left in the world. Maybe it was just a foolish dream, a desperate fantasy born of my isolation and despair. But I clung to it nonetheless, like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood in a stormy sea. Sometimes a foolish dream was all you had left to hold on to. I took a deep breath and opened my eyes, staring out into the darkness of the ruined city. I knew I had to keep going, had to keep searching for some way to survive. But I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. Sooner or later, I would have to take a chance, to reach out to the other survivors, to try to build some kind of community in the midst of the chaos. It would be a risk, I knew. There was no guarantee that the other survivors would be friendly, or that they would even exist at all. And so I made a promise to myself, there in the darkness of my makeshift shelter. I would keep searching, keep fighting, keep hoping, until I found a way to build a new life from the ashes of the old. or until the world finally claimed me as one of its own, and I joined the ranks of the undead forever. The loneliness and desperation were taking their toll on me. I knew I couldn't survive much longer without proper supplies, so I decided to take a chance and raid the nearby supermarket. I had been avoiding the place for weeks, knowing that it would be crawling with zombies. But I was out of options. I needed food, water, and medical supplies, and the supermarket was the only place I could think of that might have what I needed. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest as I surveyed the scene. The windows were shattered, and the doors hung off their hinges, evidence of the chaos that had engulfed the city in the early days of the outbreak. I could hear the moans of the undead coming from inside, a low, constant drone that sent shivers down my spine. I knew I was walking into a death trap, but I had no choice. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, my gun drawn and my senses on high alert. The stench of rotting flesh was overwhelming, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I made my way down the aisles, stepping carefully over the scattered debris and the bodies of the fallen. I could see the zombies lurking in the shadows, their eyes glinting with hunger as they watched me pass. I managed to find a few cans of food and some bottled water, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to last me more than a few days. I needed to find medical supplies, bandages, antibiotics, painkillers. I was just about to give up when I spotted the pharmacy at the back of the store. I hurried over, my heart racing with anticipation. But as I approached, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The shuffling footsteps of a zombie coming from just behind the pharmacy counter. I knew I had only seconds before it was upon me. I leaped over the counter, my gun at the ready. And there it was, a single zombie, its face twisted with hunger as it lunged towards me. I fired off a shot, the bullet tearing through its skull and sending it crumpling to the ground. But the sound of the gunshot had attracted the attention of the other zombies in the store. I could hear them coming, their moans growing louder as they closed in on my position. I grabbed as many supplies as I could carry and made a run for it, my heart pounding in my ears as I raced towards the exit. But there were too many of them, and I found myself surrounded, the zombies closing in from all sides. I fired off shot after shot, but I knew it was only a matter of time before I was overwhelmed. And then I saw it. A small window, high up on the wall. It was a tight squeeze, but it was my only chance. I holstered my gun and ran towards the shelves, leaping up and scrabbling for purchase. I could feel the zombies grabbing at my legs, their fingers brushing against my skin. But I managed to pull myself up and through the window, tumbling out onto the street below. I landed hard, the breath knocked out of my lungs. But I didn't have time to catch my breath. I could hear the zombies inside, their moans growing louder as they tried to follow me out. I grabbed my supplies and ran, my lungs burning and my heart pounding as I raced through the empty streets. I didn't stop until I was back at my safe house, the door barricaded behind me. I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. I had made it out alive, but just barely. And as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the moans of the undead outside, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could go on like this. The world had ended, and I was alone, fighting for survival in a city of the dead. And yet, even as the despair threatened to overwhelm me, I knew I had to keep going. Because giving up meant death, and I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance, however slim, that I might find a way out of this nightmare. And so I picked myself up, my body aching and my mind weary, and prepared to face another day in the city of the dead. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desolate city streets. I had been on the run all day, scavenging for supplies and dodging the clutches of the undead. My body was exhausted, my mind numb with fatigue. I stumbled upon an old storage facility, its metal doors rusted and dented. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do for the night. I pried open the door with a crowbar, wincing as the metal screeched in protest. Inside, the air was stale and musty, thick with the stench of decay. I made my way through the maze of storage units, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow in the stillness. And then I heard it. a low, guttural moan coming from somewhere in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat, my hand tightening on the grip of my gun. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room, searching for the source of the sound. And there, in the corner, I saw it. A zombie, its flesh rotting and peeling, its eyes glinting with a feral hunger. I raised my gun to fire, but the creature was too quick. It lunged at me, its teeth snapping at my throat. I threw myself backwards, stumbling over a pile of debris. The zombie followed, its hands grasping at my clothes. I managed to get a shot off, the bullet tearing through the creature's shoulder. But it barely slowed it down, its hunger driving it forward. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear more moans now, coming from all around me. The storage facility was infested, the undead drawn to the sound of my struggle. I ran, weaving through the maze of units, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the zombies behind me, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. I found an empty unit and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I pressed my back against the metal, my chest heaving with exertion. Outside, I could hear the zombies clawing at the door, their moans filled with a desperate hunger. I closed my eyes, my hands shaking as I gripped my gun. I knew I was trapped, with no way out. The zombies would keep coming, drawn by the scent of my living flesh. It was only a matter of time before they broke through. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the sound of the undead outside. I could feel the weight of my exhaustion pressing down on me, the hopelessness of my situation threatening to overwhelm me. I thought about all the people I had lost, all the friends and family who had been taken by the outbreak. I thought about the life I had once had, the world that had been lost forever, and I realized that I was tired of running, tired of fighting. I had been on my own for so long, struggling to survive in a world that had no place for me. Maybe it was time to let go, to accept the inevitable. Maybe it was time to join the ranks of the undead, to find some kind of peace in the mindless hunger that consumed them. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I felt a flicker of something else, a spark of defiance, a glimmer of hope that refused to be extinguished. I couldn't give up, not yet. I had to keep fighting, keep pushing forward, because as long as I was alive, there was still a chance to find others, to build something new from the ashes of the old world. And so I sat there in the darkness, my back pressed against the door, and waited for the dawn to come. I knew it would be a long night, a night of terror and despair. But I also knew that I would survive it, just as I had survived everything else this world had thrown at me. Because in the end, survival was all that mattered, and I was a survivor, through and through. Dawn broke over the city, casting a pale light through the cracks in the storage unit's walls. I had survived the night, but barely. The zombies had clawed at the door for hours, their moans echoing in the darkness. But eventually, they had moved on, drawn by some other sound or scent. I emerged from the unit cautiously, my gun at the ready. The facility was quiet now, the only sound the distant groans of the undead. I knew I couldn't stay here. It was only a matter of time before the zombies returned. I made my way out of the facility and back onto the streets. I had no destination in mind, no plan for survival. I was simply moving, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to stay one step ahead of the horde. And then I saw it, a building that stood out from the rest, its walls still intact and its windows unbroken. It was a library, a place of knowledge and learning in a world that had forgotten both. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was worth the risk. Libraries were often targeted by looters in the early days of the outbreak, their shelves stripped bare of anything useful. But something about this place called to me, a sense of peace, a feeling of sanctuary amidst the chaos of the city. I made my way inside, stepping carefully over the debris that littered the entrance. The air was musty and thick with dust, but it was blessedly free of the stench of decay. I wandered through the stacks, my fingers trailing over the spines of the books. It had been so long since I had seen anything like this, a reminder of the world that had been lost. I found a section of books on survival, on how to live off the land and defend oneself against the undead. I settled down in a corner, my back against the wall, and began to read. For hours, I lost myself in the pages, my mind consumed by the knowledge they contained. I learned how to purify water, how to set traps for game, how to treat wounds and fight off infection. But more than that, I found solace in the act of reading itself, a connection to the world that had been, a way to escape the horrors of the present. As the day wore on, I could feel my exhaustion catching up with me. I had been running on adrenaline for too long, my body pushed to its limits. I knew I needed to rest, to gather my strength for the trials ahead. And so I barricaded myself in the library, using shelves and furniture to block the entrances and windows. I settled down in a corner, my gun within easy reach, and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling of safety in this small sanctuary. I slept deeply, my dreams free of the nightmares that had haunted me for so long. And when I woke, I felt refreshed, my mind clear and focused. I spent the next few days in the library, reading and resting, gathering my strength for the journey ahead. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. The zombies would eventually find me, and I would have to move on. But for now, this place was my sanctuary, a brief respite from the horrors of the world outside. And I was grateful for it, for the small moments of peace it had given me. As I prepared to leave, I took one last look around the library, committing it to memory. I knew I might never see a place like this again, a reminder of the world that had been lost. But I also knew that I carried that world with me, in the knowledge I had gained and the memories I held dear. And as long as I had that, I had hope. Hope for a future beyond the city of the dead. Hope for a life worth living. And so I stepped out into the sunlight, my gun at the ready, and my mind clear, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Because in the end, that was all any of us could do. Keep moving forward, keep fighting for survival, keep holding on to hope in a world that had forgotten what that meant. I left the library behind, my backpack heavy with the supplies I had gathered. The streets were quiet, but I knew it wouldn't last. The zombies were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. As I made my way through the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air was thick with a sense of unease, a tension that I had never felt before. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a moan, but not the usual sound of a single zombie. This was a chorus of moans, a cacophony of hunger and desperation. I turned a corner and froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in front of me, was a horde of zombies, a sea of writhing bodies that stretched as far as the eye could see. I had never seen so many of them in one place before. They were pouring in from every direction, drawn by some unseen force. I knew I had to run, to get as far away from the horde as possible. But even as I turned to flee, I could feel the hopelessness of my situation wash over me. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The city was being overrun, the undead tide sweeping through the streets like a plague. I ran, my lungs burning and my legs aching. I could hear the zombies behind me, their moans growing louder with every passing second. I ducked into an alleyway, hoping to lose them in the maze of buildings. But they kept coming, their relentless pursuit driving me deeper into the city. I knew I was being herded, pushed towards some unknown destination. But I had no choice but to keep running, to keep fighting for every breath. And then I saw it. A building that stood apart from the rest, its walls high and its windows boarded up. It was a fortress, a last bastion of hope in a city of the dead. I made my way towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the zombies behind me, their moans echoing off the buildings. I reached the door and pounded on it, my fists raw and bleeding. But there was no response, no sign of life within. I knew I was alone, the last living soul in a city of the dead. And with the horde at my heels, I knew that my time was running out. I turned to face the zombies, my weapon raised and my heart pounding. I would make my last stand here, would fight until my last breath. And so I stood alone, my back to the door and my eyes fixed on the undead tide that surged towards me. I fired my weapon until it clicked empty. And then I fought with my fists and my feet and my teeth. I could feel myself weakening, could feel the life draining from my body with every blow, but I kept fighting, kept struggling, kept clinging to life with every ounce of strength I had, because I was a survivor, and that was what survivors did. They fought, they struggled, they clung to life with every fiber of their being. And I would keep fighting, keep struggling, keep surviving, until the very end. I stumbled into the building, my body aching and my mind reeling from the endless hours of fighting. The horde had pursued me relentlessly, their numbers seeming to grow with every passing moment. I had managed to find my way to this abandoned office building, its sturdy walls and narrow corridors providing some measure of protection against the undead tide. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. I barricaded the doors and windows as best I could, using desks and filing cabinets to create a makeshift fortress. I could hear the zombies outside, their moans and growls echoing through the empty halls. I was exhausted, my body pushed to the brink of collapse. But I couldn't rest, couldn't let my guard down for even a moment. I took stock of my supplies, counting out the few remaining bullets and the handful of energy bars that I had managed to scavenge. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As the hours ticked by, I could feel the tension mounting. The zombies were growing more agitated, their attempts to break through the barricades becoming more frenzied and desperate. I knew that I was in for the fight of my life. The horde was unlike anything I had ever faced before, a relentless tide of undead flesh that seemed to have no end. I took up position at one of the windows, my rifle at the ready. I could see the zombies below, their rotting faces twisted into snarls of hunger and rage. And then they came. A wave of bodies crashing against the barricades like a tsunami of death. I fired into the crowd, my bullets tearing through flesh and bone. But for every zombie that fell, two more seemed to take its place. They clawed at the walls, their fingers scrabbling for purchase on the smooth concrete. I could feel my ammunition running low, could hear the click of an empty chamber as I pulled the trigger again and again. And still, they kept coming. I retreated further into the building, my heart pounding and my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the zombies behind me, their growls echoing off the walls. I found myself in a large open space, a room that had once been filled with cubicles and office chairs. Now, it was a battlefield, a last stand against the undead horde. I turned to face them, my fists clenched and my teeth bared in a snarl of defiance. I would not go down without a fight. They came at me in a rush, their hands grasping and their teeth snapping. I met them head-on, my fists and feet lashing out in a desperate fury. I could feel their teeth and claws tearing at my flesh, could feel the hot rush of my own blood as it spilled onto the floor. But I kept fighting, kept swinging and kicking and biting with every ounce of strength I had left. The minutes ticked by, each moment an eternity of pain and terror. My body was a mass of wounds, my clothing torn and soaked with blood. And still, they kept coming. I fought with everything I had, my muscles screaming in agony and my lungs burning with every breath. The zombies pressed in from all sides, their hands grasping and their teeth gnashing. But somehow, through some miracle of will and determination, I managed to hold them off. I fought until my fists were raw and bleeding, until my body was on the verge of collapse. And then, just as I thought I could fight no more, I heard a sound that made my heart leap with hope. It was the sound of gunfire, coming from somewhere outside the building. The zombies hesitated, their attention drawn by the noise. I seized my chance, using the momentary distraction to make a break for the stairs. I half ran, half stumbled up the steps, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I burst onto the roof, the cool night air rushing into my lungs. I could see the city stretched out before me, a sea of darkness punctuated by the distant glow of fires. And there, on the horizon, I saw it, a flare, arcing up into the sky like a beacon of hope. I felt a surge of emotions wash over me, relief, joy, and a desperate, aching longing for human contact. I didn't know who had fired the flare, or what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. I was not alone. And as long as I had that knowledge, as long as I had that hope, I would keep fighting. I would survive.